If the German immigration story is one of organized colonization, the Czech story is one of pure survival. A tale of tragedy so devastating it seems impossible anyone lived through it. Yet they did, and they thrived. In the 1850s, there was no independent country called Czechoslovakia. The Czech people lived under the rule of the Austrian Empire, particularly in the regions of Bohemia and Moravia. For Czech peasants, life was suffocating. The empire controlled nearly everything. What language you could speak in school? German, not Czech. What religion you could practice? Catholicism, officially. And whether you could own land. Most couldn't. Then came the crop failures. Potatoes and grain rotted in the fields. Families that had barely scraped by now faced starvation. The Austrian government offered little help. Instead, military conscription increased. Young Czech men were forced into the Austrian army to fight in wars they didn't believe in. But Czech immigrants in America were writing letters home, and these letters told a different story. One man, named Bergman, wrote from Texas about land so cheap you could buy a farm for what a single cow cost back home. He wrote about religious freedom, about speaking Czech openly, about a future for your children. In the villages around Landskrona in Bohemia, 74 people made a desperate decision. They would sell everything they owned, their furniture, their livestock, their family heirlooms, and use the money to buy passage to Texas. Among them were the Lesacar and Schiller families, along with grandparents, teenagers, and small children. They pooled their resources and prepared for a journey into the unknown. In November 1851, the group left their villages with hope in their hearts. Their plan was simple: travel to Hamburg, book passage on a ship directly to Galveston, and start their new lives in Texas. But in Hamburg, disaster struck before they even left Europe. A man named Herman approached them. He claimed to be a shipping agent and said he could get them cheaper passage, but not from Hamburg. They'd need to go to Liverpool, England instead. Tired, confused, and not speaking English or German well, the Czechs trusted him. It was the worst mistake of their lives. Herman was a con artist. He pocketed most of their money and put them on a decrepit sailing ship called the Maria. Unlike the steamships that were becoming common, the Maria was old, slow, and in terrible condition. And instead of carrying a reasonable number of passengers, it was dangerously overcrowded. The voyage across the Atlantic took 63 days. 63 days crammed into a dark, airless hold with hundreds of other desperate people. The food was rotten. The water was foul. Disease spread like wildfire through the packed quarters. Typhus, called ship fever because it thrived in exactly these conditions, broke out. Typhus is transmitted by body lice, and in the filthy, overcrowded conditions of the Maria, there was no escaping it. The fever would start, then came the terrible rash, then delirium. Many victims simply wasted away, burning with fever in the darkness below decks. By the time the Maria limped into New Orleans in February 1852, the Czech immigrants were traumatized and decimated. 9 members of their group had died during the voyage or shortly after arrival. The survivors had spent almost all their remaining money on doctors and medicine in New Orleans. But they had come for Texas, and they were determined to get there. The bedraggled group boarded a steamship called the Mexico for the short trip from New Orleans to Galveston. They arrived on February 17, 1852, 3 months after leaving their villages, but their ordeal was nowhere near finished. On Galveston's docks, no one was waiting for them. No one had been notified of their arrival. Unlike the Germans with their organized Adelsverein, the Czechs had no support network, no welcoming committee, no plan. They managed to book passage on a small boat up Buffalo Bayou to Houston. During this journey, 2 more tragedies struck. 2 infants, already weakened by months of hardship, died. Their tiny bodies were wrapped in cloth and committed to the waters of the bayou. Imagine being those parents, having survived an ocean crossing, only to lose your child within sight of the land you dreamed about. In Houston, the locals took one look at the ragged, sick, desperate Czech immigrants and wanted nothing to do with them. Houston in 1852 was a rough frontier town, but even by those standards, this group looked wretched and destitute. No one offered help. The Czechs learned that there was a small Czech settlement at a place called Cat Spring, about 80 miles west. With no money for wagons or supplies, they set out on foot, carrying what little they had left. Then came the final obstacle, the Brazos River. Spring rains had swollen the Brazos into a churning, dangerous torrent. There was no bridge and no way to cross. The group set up camp on the riverbank and waited. And waited. For 18 days, they camped by that river, watching their food supplies dwindle to nothing. They ate whatever they could scavenge, wild plants, small animals, anything. Children cried from hunger. Adults grew weak. When the waters finally receded enough to cross, the survivors stumbled into Cat Spring in April 1852. Of the original 74 people who had left their Czech villages 5 months earlier, fewer than half had survived. The existing Czech families at Cat Spring were shocked by what walked out of the wilderness. These weren't robust pioneers. They were skeleton-thin, sick, and traumatized survivors of an unimaginable ordeal. But here's the remarkable thing. They stayed. They didn't give up and return to Europe, even if they'd had the money to do so, which they didn't. Instead, they took the land they'd dreamed about, cleared it, planted it, and built farms. And then they did something that showed incredible courage. They wrote letters home. But these weren't sugar-coated propaganda. The survivors told the truth. They described the terrible voyage, the deaths, the hunger, the hardships. But they also described something else. The land. Rich, black soil perfect for farming. The ability to own that land, not rent it from a noble. Religious freedom. The right to speak Czech without persecution. The message was clear. The journey will test every fiber of your being. You might die trying. But if you survive, you can build something here that's impossible back home. Incredibly, more Czechs came. Over the following decades, the Czech community in Texas grew and thrived. They settled primarily in Fayette and Lavaca counties, creating a distinctive Czech cultural region that lasted well into the 20th century. Unlike many immigrant groups who gradually lost their native language, Czechs fought hard to preserve theirs. By the late 1800s, Texas had over 30 Czech language newspapers and periodicals, including Svoboda, Freedom, and Nový Domov, New Home. Czech communities established their own schools, where children learned to read and write in both Czech and English. Even today, linguists study Texas Czech, a unique dialect that evolved in isolation from European Czech, preserving some older forms of the language while also incorporating English words and Texas influences. The trauma of those early arrivals taught Czechs a hard lesson. You had to take care of your own because no one else would. They created the SPJST, Slovanská podporující jednota státu Texas, the Slavonic Benevolent Order of the State of Texas, a massive mutual aid society. The SPJST was like a combination insurance company, social club, and community center. Members paid dues, and in return, if your house burned down, the organization helped rebuild it. If you died, they made sure your widow and children were cared for. They built impressive lodge halls in small Texas towns, ornate buildings that seem out of place in rural areas, but testify to the organizational power of the Czech community. The Czechs brought their cuisine to Texas, and it's stuck. The kolache, a sweet pastry filled with fruit, poppy seeds, or cheese, became a Texas staple. Stop at any small-town Texas bakery, and you'll likely find kolaches. The klobásnek, a savory variation with sausage, is actually a Texas Czech invention that doesn't exist in the Czech Republic, a perfect symbol of cultural fusion. Czech communities maintain traditions like krasliče, intricate egg decorating at Easter, and harvest festivals. These weren't just nostalgic remembrances, they were ways of maintaining community identity and passing culture to the next generation. The story of the Czech immigrants who came through Galveston is darker than the German tale of organized colonization. It's a story of con artists, disease, death, and suffering. More than half of that original group of 74 died before they could build a single house or plant a single crop. But it's also a story of unbreakable human resilience. The survivors could have given up. They could have become bitter. Instead, they built thriving communities that enrich Texas culturally and economically. Today, towns like West Texas, famous for its Czech bakeries, and annual Czech festivals across Central Texas, are living monuments to people who refuse to let tragedy defeat them. Every kolache you eat, every polka you hear at a Czech festival, every SPJST hall you pass in a small Texas town, they're all echoes of those desperate families who came through Galveston in the 1850s, survived the unsurvivable, and chose to build rather than surrender. Their story reminds us that Texas wasn't built by people who had it easy. It was built by people who endured the unendurable and somehow found the strength to keep going. Be sure to hit like and subscribe to continue this journey through the Golden Door and find out how other groups immigrated to Texas through Galveston. Let me know in the comments what you think so far, and what other parts of history would you like to see covered. Until next time, stay curious.